Well, good morning and good afternoon. My apologies for not being at the temple. I'm sick today, and I thought it wouldn't be a very good idea to bring my cold into the space. But it's kind of apt situation that I'm propped up here in bed, because the topic for today's talk is a practice-centered life. As lay practitioners, we can have a practice-centered life. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. Some of the different ways people can practice is you can have a monastic practice where you're living in a monastery and have a clear schedule laid out every day. Well, the bell wakes you early in the morning and you have a sitting schedule and a work schedule and a meal schedule, periods of time for study. And luckily, there are some options for doing that in the West now for people. And there has been, of course, in Asian countries for a long time. But another sort of way is you could call a temple-centered life, where if you live somewhere where there is a zendo space that offers zazen every day, you can have a life that kind of revolves around that temple, which of course many people in Santa Cruz, where I used to live, are able to do that. Where every day you can go to the zendo and be with the sangha and really make that a touchstone for your life on a daily or almost daily basis. So a temple-centered life. And then for many people, probably the majority maybe of people who are practicing in modern Western countries, is you can have what you could call a practice-centered life or a dharma-centered life, which means even though you're not having a strict daily schedule, you still can turn yourself towards practice. And I often just think of it a bit like a sunflower turns towards the sun. It tracks with the sun during the day. We can have our ordinary lay life, whatever that involves, going to work, or looking after children, caring for somebody, studying, whatever sort of life we might have, we can still have the Dharma, the teachings, and our practice can still be at the center of our life. And for a lot of people, it kind of gradually becomes that over many years. It starts off being something that you do a bit, like maybe join in Zazen a few times a week, maybe think about the teachings a few times a week, maybe listen to a Dharma talk every so often. But often when you're busy, when people are busy, they're not thinking about the Dharma. They're just caught up in the busyness of whatever it is. But over time, we can actually have a sense of the Buddha's teachings informing us kind of all the time, or almost all the time. Whatever we're doing, they're not far away from our mind. They're kind of close. They're our reference point kind of all the time. It's the lens through which we see the world and see our life and make sense of our experiences. And it's a beautiful way to live. I think it's more accurate than a lot of the other ways that people see the world in terms of a lens to look at the world through. It's compassionate. You know, part of our teaching has a strong emphasis on ethical conduct and care for others. So it's a caring lens through which to see the world. And I definitely have found it to be both a joyful way to function in the world, and less effortful than a lot of other ways. And I think that is an indication that it's more in accord with the nature of things. The Buddha's teachings are in accord with the nature of things. So when we function from that place, life is a little easier even when it's difficult. So there isn't any really fixed way that a practice-centered life looks, but there are some things that are usually pretty common for a practice-centered life or a Dharma-centered life. And probably the most common thread is daily zazen, some kind of regular daily practice, or almost daily, but generally daily is good. And sitting with other people, whether that's in person or online, but having other people that we sit with in some kind of regular way. It's kind of creates a foundation, a really steady foundation for practice, to have that connectedness with other people, which is an expression of the fact that we don't function as independent beings. We are interconnected with everything else. So just to be with Sangha is expressing that truth. So sitting daily is a pretty common thread for practice-centered life. And also some kind of studying, whether that's reading just alone, reading books that you buy, or listening to podcasts or Dharma talks, or studying with the teacher, but really taking in the teachings. And there's no end to the amount of study that we can do, even though sometimes we talk about Zen as the way outside of letters, the way outside of scholarship. We also love scholarship too. We also love reading and studying. So it's good to study. And another aspect of a practice-centered life is having some sense of ethics. And in our tradition, we have precepts that we follow. People do a Jukai ceremony and receive the precepts. And they're the kinds of vows that we can kind of intuit make sense, to honor life and care for life, to honor truth and honesty, and those sorts of things, not to engage in harmful conduct. So a kind of intentionality about that, a real aspiration to want to be an honest, caring person, and a person who also is honest and caring about oneself, kind to ourselves, honoring ourselves. It's not just caring and honoring other people, it's caring and honoring ourselves as well, because we're all part of the whole mosaic. And of course, giving most of our attention to the present moment rather than giving our attention to thoughts about the past and the future. This is one of the most central parts of Buddha's teaching, is that this is where it's all happening, in the here and now. This place, this moment, this is where it's at, right here and now. And to give more of our attention to this here and now. And notice that when we're thinking about the past and the future, that we're thinking about the past and the future in the present moment. So as long as we're noticing that we're thinking about the past and the future, but we notice that we're doing it right now in the present moment, then that's okay. And we need to think about the past and the future sometimes, of course, to function. But just having that sense that this is where it's all happening, right here, right now. and really giving our attention to the present moment. That's an important part of a temple-centered life or a Dharma-centered life, practice-centered life. And being of service in some way, which fits with ethics, different ways of being of service. We can be of service in the more obvious kinds of ways of being helpful to other people, but also using our capacity as a way of being of service. Because each of us are unique expressions of Buddha nature. And whatever our capacities are, whether we've got a great intellect or great artistic ability, or actually average intellect and average artistic ability, doesn't really matter. Whatever our ability is, to use that, to use our abilities. That's called not being stingy with the Dharma, not being stingy with ourselves. So sharing ourselves, that's part of service to others. And another thing that I like to do a lot, and I think is good to really cultivate, is just a sense of a contemplative practice, just contemplating. You know, our mind thinks all day, every day, and we can think about all sorts of random things, but we can practice after a while to actually contemplate the teachings. In the here and now, while we're doing things, we can also be seeing how true these teachings are when we look at the world around us. So I've just made a little bit of a list of different ways to cultivate this kind of practice-centered life in no particular order, and it's just a list that I just made up. But sitting with Sangha, which we're all doing right now, where possible, doing retreats, one-day sits or multiple day sits, sessions, is really very, very valuable thing to do. If you can do a couple a year, it really deepens our practice to get that time of really dedicating to sitting for, many periods of zazen a day. Memorizing verses is a great thing to do. We talked about that the other day, I think at one of our morning sits. Some of the verses that we chant are quite simple and don't take too long to memorize, like the Metta Sutta or Trust in Mind, the Heart Sutra. It's really great to memorize those. It's something that's not really part of modern culture so much to memorize things, but it's great to memorize. Then you can be, when you've got a spare bit of time, you can just recite in your mind one of these beautiful, wise wisdom traditions. We can also anchor with the breath many times a day, just like a mindfulness bell. Many times throughout the day, just notice that we can breathe and breathe in and breathe out. If we just do that a number of times a day, it somehow gives a sense of sanity just to notice the breath every day, very intentionally. And we can have other mindfulness bells. People have different sorts of ways in which they can be mindful, like stepping over a threshold is one that I like to use a lot. When I step through a threshold from one room to another, like the way we bow when we go in and out of the zendo. That's a little mindfulness bell. And you can create other ones. Opening and closing the car door can be a mindfulness bell. And we can also notice our own mind. Like if we're feeling some kind of agitation in the mind, it's a really good opportunity to go, I wonder what my thinking is that I feel this agitation in my mind, and to look at it closely. And often we can see that there's some kind of dualistic, erroneous view going on, some kind of split in the way that we're thinking, some self-criticism maybe, or criticizing others in our mind in some way. That's usually what's going on. Or too much self-concern, overly fixating on a sense of ourselves as a separate entity. So we can just notice that and be curious about our own mental habits. Another thing that I really like doing, which I think is also not especially popular, is practicing with renunciations, which really is kind of living a simpler life, trying to live a simple life. And we can practice just out of experimentation, because it's interesting, to renounce things and just give up things for a little while and see how that feels. It's kind of interesting. I've done lots of different renunciations, which I've talked about. And it's just a really, really interesting thing to do. It can be any number of things, like giving up jewelry or giving up alcohol for a week, or any number of things you can experiment. It's interesting just to see, you get a sense more of how the craving mind works and how our preferences work when you give something up. Maybe giving up listening to the radio for a period of time. It's not that there's anything really wrong with any of these things, but it's good to have that kind of self-discipline, that we don't need these conditioned phenomena for our mental steadiness. And I think we can make up interesting things. Something I've been doing recently is when I go running, I listen to music, and I like music that has a kind of a good beat to it to help me with running. But I can also choose music that somehow kind of keeps the Dharma alive for me. So one thing that I've done is I've downloaded Ukrainian folk songs and Russian folk songs and Palestinian folk songs and Israeli folk songs. And so by doing that, just by including that music, and not just folk songs, sort of contemporary hip hop songs from those different cultures, that just helps me keep this open-heartedness towards all the conflicts that are happening in the world, and keep myself open-hearted to everybody involved. So that's just one little thing that I do. I've got a song that I downloaded of an old whaling song. So even though I think whaling is probably not really a very good thing to do these days, I can appreciate pre-industrial times how brave people were when they went out whaling in their wooden boats. So there's all sorts of things like that. I've got all sorts of songs that I listen to that just remind me of this whole variety of ways that Buddha nature manifests itself in the world. So that's one example of a kind of idiosyncratic way of keeping the Dharma in my life. And I'm sure we can all find lots of those. So I'd like to finish by reading a section from Suzuki Roshi, a chapter called Nirvana, the Waterfall. It's one of the most beautiful chapters in this book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And he's talking about a waterfall. So I think we can think of this practice-centered life as being us being like this waterfall. So I'll read it out. I went to Yosemite National Park and I saw some huge waterfalls. The highest one there is 1,340 feet high. And from it, the water comes down like a curtain thrown from the top of a mountain. It does not seem to come down swiftly as you might expect. It seems to come down very slowly because of the distance. And the water does not come down as one stream, but is separated into many tiny streams. From a distance, it looks like a curtain. And I thought it must be very difficult. It must be a very difficult experience for each drop of water to come down from the top of such a high mountain. It takes time, a long time, for the water finally to reach the bottom of the waterfall. And it seems to me that our human life may be like this. We have many difficult experiences in our life. But at the same time, I thought the water was not originally separated but was one whole river. Only when it is separated does it have some difficulty in falling. It is as if the water does not have any feeling when it is one whole river. Only when separated into many drops can it begin to have or to express some feeling. When we see one whole river, we do not feel the living activity of the water. But when we dip a part of the water into a dipper, we experience some feeling of the water. And we also feel the value of the person who uses the water. Feeling ourselves and the water in this way, we cannot use it in just a material way. It is a living thing. Before we were born, we had no feeling. We were one with the universe. This is called mind only, or essence of mind, or big mind. After we are separated by birth from this oneness, as the water falling from the waterfall is separated by the wind and rocks, then we have feeling. You have difficulty because you have feeling. You attach to the feeling you have without knowing just how this kind of feeling is created. When you do not realize that you are one with the river or one with the universe, you have fear. Whether it is separated into drops or not, water is water. Our life and death are the same thing. When we realize this fact, we have no fear of death anymore, and we have no actual difficulty in our life. When the water returns to its original oneness with the river, it no longer has any individual feeling to it. It resumes its own nature and it finds composure. How very glad the water must be to come back to the original river. If this is so, what feeling will we have when we die? I think we are like the water in the dipper. We will have composure then, perfect composure. It may be too perfect for us just now because we are so much attached to our own feeling, to our own individual existence. For us, just now, we have some fear of death. But after we resume our original true self, there is nirvana. That is why we say to attain nirvana is to pass away. To pass away is not a very adequate expression. Perhaps to pass on or to go on or to join would be better. Would you try to find some better expression for death? When you find it, you'll have quite a new interpretation of your life. It will be like my experience when I saw the water in the big waterfall. Imagine, it was 1,340 feet high. We say everything comes out of emptiness. One whole river or one whole mind is emptiness. When we reach this understanding, we find the true meaning of our life. When we reach this understanding, we can see the beauty of human life. Before we realize this fact, everything that we see is just delusion. Sometimes we overestimate the beauty. Sometimes we underestimate or ignore the beauty because our small mind is not in accord with reality. To talk about it in this way is quite easy, but to have the actual feeling is not so easy. But by your practice of Zazen, you can cultivate this feeling. When you can sit with your whole body and mind and with the oneness of your mind and body under the control of the universal mind, you can easily attain this kind of right understanding. Your everyday life will be renewed without being attached to an old erroneous interpretation of life. When you realize this fact, you will discover how meaningless your old interpretation was and how much useless effort you had been making. You will find the true meaning of life. And even though you have difficulty falling upright from the top of the waterfall to the bottom of the mountain, you will enjoy your life. I really like this very last line where he says, and even though you will have difficulty falling upright from the top of the waterfall to the bottom of the mountain, you will enjoy your life. I think that's what a practice-centered life is falling upright as a drop of water from the river at the top to the river at the bottom. So I'll stop there and see if anyone would like to comment or ask a question.